Welcome back to another one of your flip lectures. Today we're going to talk about the history behind the Constitution of the United States. Now, the Constitution of the United States was actually not the first government that the United States had. In 1777, during the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress needed to create a government. And they didn't create the Constitution, they actually created a document called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation was meant to set up a country that was a very loose union of the different states that would be independent, but would also be governed by a Congress. And under the Articles of Confederation, the governments of the states would be very, very strong. And by contrast, the central government that would govern all of the states would actually be very weak. And the reason that originally the United States didn't trust a strong central government is that the entire Revolutionary War was fought because the American colonies really didn't want that strong British government ruling them. And they had just fought a war, and so they didn't want to set up a government the same as the one in Great Britain. And so the Articles of Confederation set up a government that would be ruled by the Confederation Congress. And how this would work is every state would choose representatives, and they would gather once a year to form the Congress, which at the time, that was the entire U.S. government. And what this Congress could do is it could declare war, raise armies, and sign treaties with other nations. So basically, this existed pretty much only to deal with foreign powers and national defense. And this government could not tax or regulate trade. And if you can't impose taxes, well, you can't raise any money. So you'll see this is going to be problematic. And also, it was allowed to make treaties, but it didn't have the power to force the states to go along with those treaties. So as you could see, this is going to be kind of very difficult to get things done. And in this Congress, each state only got one vote, meaning that the bigger states with a lot of people were not accurately represented. And also, to make any changes to this government, you needed a unanimous vote, meaning that every single member of the Congress would have to vote in favor of it. So that made it really hard to make any changes and deal with these weaknesses. And so basically, the Articles of Confederation, those restrictions caused some serious problems, and they required the United States to come up with a new way of governing. But let's just run through the problems real quick. First off, with trade, each state was allowed to set their own import taxes. And so what that resulted in was the British and other European powers would simply land their goods in their ships at the cheapest state and then sell them to other states at an increased price. Also, each state actually put taxes on goods from other states. So, for example, if you wanted to buy something from Virginia and you lived in North Carolina, you'd have to pay an extra tax just to buy that stuff from Virginia. Also, with diplomacy, the Articles of Confederation, the U.S. government could not force countries to agree to the treaties. So, right after the Revolution, some states refused to follow the terms of the treaty. And that made negotiations really difficult with other nations, because if you can't trust that your agreement is going to be honored and upheld, then why would you even negotiate or make a deal with somebody at all? And also, the economy was problematic on the Articles of Confederation. To pay off war debts from the Revolution, and honestly to pay for anything, the states have two options. A state can either raise taxes, or states could print paper money. So 7 separate states started printing paper money, not backed by anything. So each state actually had its own currency. If you were in Virginia, you would have different money than if you were in Massachusetts. This caused a lot of problems, one of which it was hard to tell, well, how much is a Virginian dollar worth compared to a dollar from South Carolina. And it also created inflation because all these states were simply printing money. And when there's more currency, it becomes less valuable. So as you can see, the Articles of Confederation, every state is acting like its own country. And that's kind of the really important thing, that every state is acting like it's its own country, making it nearly impossible for these different states to do anything together. Then this event happens. It's called Shay's Rebellion. And this is in the early United States, when a group of farmers who basically could not afford to pay new taxes, decided to arm themselves, go to the courthouses in Massachusetts, and prevent the foreclosures on their farms. And this rebellion is going to be put down. But Shay's rebellion, for a lot of Americans, kind of leads these leaders to start seeing that, these articles aren't really working. That a central government is going to be needed in order to govern these different states. And the central government needs to protect property rights, has to deal with kind of these conditions such as inflation that could cause rebellion, and also to deal with trade issues and diplomacy. So in the year 1787, the kind of leaders of the United States decided to meet at something called the Constitutional Convention. And so these delegates met together, every state but Rhode Island, so only 12 states. But they got together, and they said it was for the sole purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. They were going to change the articles to make them work. And the goal that they have for this is they're trying to balance the individuality and the rights of the individual states with that need for a stronger national government to get things done. And kind of just a little piece of trivia here. This is really considered an all-star cast. You've probably heard the term Founding Fathers before. Well, those same Founding Fathers that participated in the Revolution are also going to be at this Constitutional Convention. George Washington is elected president. Such famous people as James Madison, Ben Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, Roger Sherman, all these guys were considered to be rock stars. They were political rock stars. And so this convention is going to have a lot of street cred with the people in their respective states. But there's one kind of little problem with this. The Constitutional Convention throws out the Articles of Confederation, and they set out to create an entirely new government. Well, if you create an entirely new government, that's called a revolution. And if you overthrow the current government, that's kind of treason. So in order to kind of prevent suspicion, most of these meetings and proceedings were kept secret from the outside, so that Americans wouldn't really know what was going on. And at this convention, there's two plans that really kind of get put forward about what this new government should look like. And the main disagreements are going to be between big states and small states, as well as states with a lot of slaves and those that don't really have slavery. So the first of these plans was known as the Virginia Plan, and the architect of this was James Madison. You may remember him as the guy who was president during the War of 1812. And so James Madison comes up with a plan that's going to give the national government the power to raise money through taxing and also pass laws that all of the states are required to follow. So that solves basically the big problems with what the national government needs to be able to do. However, the Virginia Plan said that the number of representatives should always be determined by state population, meaning that the bigger states would get more representatives than the smaller states. He also proposed a two houses of legislature. This is what is known as bicameral legislature, meaning two houses. And his idea was that one house should have representatives elected by the people, and the other would have representatives elected by the state legislature. The idea being that in the Virginia Plan, they didn't want everybody to basically be able to vote on the representatives. They thought that by letting state legislatures elect people, that they would be able to elect people who'd be able to represent the interests of the entire state. And so the Virginia Plan is favored by the larger states because it favors them. But the smaller states are going to oppose it because representation is based on population, something that's going to give them a disadvantage. And the small states were not too happy about the Virginia Plan, so they got William Paterson to come up with another plan. And because Paterson was from New Jersey, it became known as the New Jersey Plan. And in this plan, just like the other one, the national government would be able to raise taxes and regulate trade. So both of these plans are looking to solve the same problems. However, in the New Jersey Plan, they only wanted a single House of Congress, in which each state had an equal number of representatives. And so the smaller states supported this plan, but the larger states opposed it because they said that it gave too much power to the smaller states and not enough to the larger ones. So you have two plans, and you got to come up with one. So what happened is that the people at this Constitutional Convention chose to work out a compromise based on the Virginia Plan. They also decided they were going to throw the Articles of Confederation out, saying that they were ineffective, didn't give the federal government the power that it needed, and so they were going to form a new constitution and, honestly, an entirely new system of government. And the Constitutional Convention is going to need to use compromise. Both sides have things that they really want, and they have things that they're willing to move on. And so basically this Constitutional Convention is going to involve compromise. And here's a little Calvin and Hobbes cartoon kind of telling you guys about the merits of this. So the two sides come together for a great compromise. And this is also going to be known as the Connecticut Compromise, but just know this is the compromise at the Constitutional Convention. And like our friends Calvin and Hobbes said, both sides are going to try to hold fast where they can, but they're also going to compromise where they need to. And so the issues at stake are representation, slavery, and trade regulations. Now, slavery isn't the debate whether or not there should be slavery. It's the debate over whether or not to count slaves as part of the population. And both sides also agree that at the end, after they pass the Constitution, they're going to create a Bill of Rights that is going to be the first 10 amendments to the Constitution to basically map out the rights that all American citizens are going to have. And the reason for this Bill of Rights is that people were afraid of a strong central government. But by compromising and giving a Bill of Rights, most people came around to the idea that this Bill of Rights would protect citizens from a strong federal government. And so the Great Compromise solves the problem of representation by combining the two plans. They decide to have two houses of legislature, a House of Representative, where the number of representatives is determined by the population. And this house is also the one that was directly elected by the people. Then they created the Senate, which had an equal number of representatives, and those equal number of representatives for each state, and then those would be elected by the state legislatures. So as you see, kind of both these plans kind of come together. They decided to deal with slavery in something known as the 3/5 Compromise. Basically, the southern states that had a lot of slaves wanted to count the slaves for population, whereas the northern states that didn't have as many slaves said that since they weren't people, they were property, they shouldn't count. And so a compromise is reached, where they decide that for population purposes, every 5 slaves would count as 3 free persons. This is known as the 3/5 Compromise. So it's an interesting idea that they're compromising, but they're also saying that every slave is only worth 3/5 of a person. They also agree not to deal with the issue of slavery. This is kind of an important thing in early American history, that each generation kind of kicks the can of slavery down the road, and nobody really wants to deal with this issue. Eventually, this issue is going to be settled in the American Civil War, but the U.S. Congress at this time decided that slavery can't be banned before 1808 in order to basically try to prevent the banning of slavery. They also agreed to put a limit on the amount of taxes for importing slaves, and the whole kind of idea of this is that they are trying to prevent slavery from being outlawed, but they're also just trying not to deal with this issue. So they decide not to deal with the issue until the year 1808. And they also said that the national government would not be able to tax exports, things coming out of the country. They could only tax imports, things coming into the country. So this whole Constitution was based on compromise. Everybody at this convention had to compromise on something, but everyone also got something that they wanted out of this deal. So overall, the history of the United States Constitution is one of problem solving, compromise, but also one of failing to deal with controversial issues such as slavery. But this history created the document that our government is still based on today.